Good morning, everyone. Thanks, John, for that introduction. I'm not going to say any more about myself for now, but I'll come back to that. What I wanted to do today in this opening talk is really to try and frame some of the more detailed presentations you're going to see later in the day, some of the technical discussions and explanations that you're going to get. Put that in a bit of a broader context. I'm a lawyer, so inevitably that's a legal context because as far as I'm concerned, if it's not to do with law, it's not really very interesting. You may all disagree, particularly in about 20 minutes. Now, what I want to particularly focus on is a concept that John touched on briefly, which is emerging really as a sort of broader idea in connection with data protection. You know, a lot of us, to be frank, a lot of people started thinking about data protection only with the GDPR. There'd been law before that. It had been more honoured in the breach, it has to be said. But GDPR got people focusing, and it brought into the popular consciousness a range of ideas about subject rights, something that we'll come back to later in the day. The idea of data protection by design and by default, that you would actually build systems to protect data from the outset. These were not new concepts. These were concepts that already existed under a broader conceptual idea of privacy. And that idea of privacy had a sort of long and slightly checkered history, particularly in this country. It's something that is not very well understood. And in particular, there is a real challenge, I think, with the idea that privacy, of which data protection is quite an important part, is something that only matters to people who have something to hide. Privacy is something that is important if you are in an environment where there will be real consequences if you're not able to keep secrets, for example. And in a country like ours, which for whatever faults you may think it has, is a country of sort of liberal and democratic values and history, there's been a temptation to think that privacy wasn't something that really had a lot of impact on everyday people. And I hear it again and again, why do you care about privacy if you haven't got anything to hide? The case law through which privacy emerged in this country was case law related almost exclusively to celebrities. It was related to people who had chosen to put themselves in the public eye. And the reason for that, to be frank, was that those were the people whose reputations took the biggest hit when their privacy was infringed, and who had the deepest pockets to be able to try and take things to court which didn't currently exist as legal concepts, and to try and make them real. And one of the seminal cases was this case, Campbell versus MGM. The Campbell in question is Naomi Campbell. MGM is Mirror Group newspapers. And this was a case in which a photograph was taken of Naomi Campbell falling out of a cab at a rehab centre. It wasn't public knowledge at that point that she was attending rehab. It wasn't known that she was grappling with addiction and that she decided to try and do something about it. And this was splashed all over the press, and the argument was made, well, it's in the public interest. The public are interested in what is going on in her life. She has put herself in the public gaze, so we get to report on anything that sells newspapers, essentially. And Lord Nichols in the House of Lords, in upholding the very germ of the start of an idea of privacy in this country, said this: privacy lies at the heart of liberty in a modern state. A proper degree of liberty is essential for the well-being and development of an individual. And that's a really important concept to understand. If you are not free to be yourself, if you are not free to define your identity within a framework that protects what you choose to share and what you don't choose to share, you lack a fundamental ingredient of what it means to be free. Now, at this point in writing my talk, I was very mindful that this was in danger of being exceedingly high level and conceptual. And I didn't want to do that. And I thought first, who can I pick on whose details they're happy for me to share to illustrate this concept of privacy? And of course, that would have been contrary to GDPR. So I've had to pick on myself. And what I want to do over the next few slides is just illustrate for you, as someone who has nothing to hide, how I would nevertheless want to control the version of myself that I present in different scenarios. So don't be alarmed. Nothing too steamy. We're going to start with this. This is the person that John has just introduced to you. This is the person that exists out in the world doing sort of professional legal work. I'm not going to read all the stuff on there. You know, that would be a bit too self-congratulatory, but it's there. You know, do read it. And you know, those details are all true. Those are all things about me which are true. Those are the things I choose to put on my CV. Those are the things that I choose to put on the website of my law firm, you know, on the slide when I'm introducing myself. And it presents a particular type of person. Someone who is very focused on particular legal activity, someone who has a degree of accomplishment in that field, someone who's connected to a law firm with sort of offices all around the country. And it gives contact details. And those contact details are ones that I know, if I'm contacted using those details, that someone wants to communicate with me in a professional capacity. That mobile number is a phone that's been issued to me by my office. And my office, because it doesn't have a bring your own device policy, wants me only to use that phone for work purposes. That email address, I don't share jokes with my friends using that email address. I write to clients with that email address. Now, that discipline has all sorts of important consequences. For example, it is much harder for me to inadvertently send something inappropriate to a client, because that channel of communication is separate, if it exists at all. But that's not the only me that's out there. So then I thought, well, I wonder how I'm seen by the internet, you know, by the wider world. You can't read all of this, unfortunately, but this is something that you can get if you go onto Google. This is the profiler, the ad profile of you. Now, notice, same Twitter handle, different email address. The email address is my personal email address for work-related things. Yeah? So that's the email address that I use when I'm sending myself the presentation that I'm going to do this morning, and I want to make sure that I've got it on a device that will plug into the system here if the slides I sent across don't work. It's the email address that I use to subscribe to journals and things that I want to read at the weekend rather than in the office, but work-related. Now, what that yields is a rather interesting picture, which is, in fact, inaccurate in a number of respects. They have correctly identified that I'm a 35 to 44-year-old male. They've correctly identified that I'm married, but they think I haven't got any children. And that's because in my professional persona, I don't ever talk about my children. I don't ever do anything using that Gmail profile that relates to my kids. I have a personal one for that. Apparently I'm interested in bars, clubs and nightlife. Who knew? Celebrities and entertainment news. Well, yes, professionally, yes, I probably am. Corporate events. Pets, no. Sports, no. Vehicle shopping. I mean, not often. And apparently I'm employed by a small business in the healthcare sector. So, now, yes, that's inaccurate. But it is a version of me which, as far as Google is concerned, exists. And they advertise to me on the assumption that those things are true. If I showed you my personal Gmail equivalent of this page, it's a lot more accurate, because I'm a lot more unguarded, I'm a lot more myself when I'm using that profile. Now, a lot of people don't do this. A lot of people don't segment their lives in different ways, but you should. Everyone should. And part of the reason for that, even if you have nothing to hide, as most people, fundamentally don't, is that it can be confusing if the same person presents themselves, particularly with the internet, particularly with the way that everything is connected now. If you present yourself in a lot of different ways, it's misleading. And that has two consequences, which I'll come on to in a minute. But I first want to show you the next slide, which illustrates a very different part of my personality. And this is what I do on a Thursday evening. This is the cub group that I volunteer with, and all the cubs only know me as Bagheera. They don't care how educated I am. They don't even care about my case in the Supreme Court. Can you believe it? But they care that I know how to cook them breakfast when we're away on camp. They know that I'm good at archery and firelighting. I've got a different email address for my interactions with that. I've got a different phone number, my personal phone number. Do not use it. That is a different part of my identity. It's real to those cubs, but it's not something that I want confusing my interactions with clients. It's not something that I want confusing my interactions in any other sort of adult professional environment. And so I keep it separate. I define a different part of my identity. And that, that's convenient to me. But I think if you think about this a little bit yourselves, you can understand that it is more than just convenient. Think about different parts of your life. Think about the feeling you sometimes have when you bring together people from different parts of your life. And they have got to know a slightly different version of you. A lot of people feel this most acutely when they go home with, they've got married, they've got kids, and they go back home and their parents treat them like the child they used to be. They don't recognise that they've grown up. They don't recognise that they've changed. And sometimes that leads to tension. I know it does for me. My behaviour when I'm sort of back with, particularly with my brother, and I start sort of squabbling with him all the time. And my wife sort of goes, "Oh, grow up, for goodness sake." She's frustrated because she sees that that's a different version of me to the one that I share with her. And these things matter. These things create tension in ourselves when we're not free to give ourselves to an identity, to a position. And for me, that is probably most acutely felt with this identity, which is one that I've never talked about in a legal context before, but of a published author of fantasy fiction, something which, when I started doing it, I made the judgment was going to be something that was very difficult for my clients to reconcile with my professional life. If I was publishing books in my own name, I would be presenting a very confusing picture to people who were coming to me for legal services, or for that matter, people who were coming to me for slightly postmodern fantasy fiction. Now, for me, that's a question again of convenience. That's a question of, I don't want to have to explain to people, no, the reason I didn't get your work done was because I was working for another client. It's not because I was writing 10,000 words on this. I do that at the weekends. I do that in time that's my own. Clients wouldn't understand that. They would see it as a diversion from time I should be giving to them, in my view. And I'm free to make that choice. I'm entitled to have a pen name. I'm entitled to put a different personality out there for the purposes of marketing. And when I go to writing conventions and things like that, book signings, I am Will Davidson, and I sign as Will Davidson. And no one really that knows that personality knows that I'm a lawyer. Now, for me, that's mildly convenient. My book sales are not going to be troubling any bestseller lists. I'm not going to ever be prominent as this identity. But for some people it's much more important. And you might remember a few years ago that there was a writer called Robert Galbraith who was getting onto the public scene writing detective fiction. And Robert Galbraith's detective fiction was all right, but it was something of a departure for the author who was Robert Galbraith, because she was very well known already in another field as the author of the Harry Potter books. And her lawyers, through the wife of one of the people at her law firm, breached her privacy. They disclosed that dual identity at a time that she didn't want, in a way that was problematic for her, because it distracted from what she was trying to do, which was to build a new brand, to build a new identity. And in those circumstances, this privacy can have a strong intersection with real, meaningful impacts on people. Now, I am very privileged to stand here and talk to you about that. But I am also privileged because I am a white 35 to 44-year-old male in the UK in the 21st century. And I'm able to share with you in a trusting environment the different aspects of my personality and the activities that I get up to in my own time. And we must not lose sight of the fact that even in this country, for some people, the impact is much more serious. The impact is even more serious than it was for J.K. Rowling, who frankly, Robert Galbraith's book sales were probably not harmed by the knowledge that he was actually a celebrity author of the Harry Potter stories. Even in this country, there are people who have to be very, very careful about disclosing particular aspects of their identity, about opening up their privacy. And if that is true in this country, then it is even more true in other countries. Now, later on today, I'm doing a talk about facial recognition technology. And I'm working with clients to build technology that is compliant. But we are always conscious, very conscious, that that same technology, once it is built, can be sold anywhere in the world, can be used in countries that have a very repressive attitude, who take an approach that if you identify as an opponent of that state, the consequences will be extremely severe. And that is the same privacy. The privacy of the protester on the street in Hong Kong with the mask on his face, trying to avoid being imprisoned and beaten, and the privacy of the journalist in Russia who wants to file stories that are critical of the state and survive, is the same privacy that we are all contemplating, that we are all trying to build by design into the systems and the processes that we're all developing together as we grapple with this post-GDPR world. And that is a challenge, but I hope in these few minutes I've shown you that it is a challenge that is worth getting to grips with. Thank you.